Welcome to this IBMS Support Hub, all about placements, and hopefully you're on the call because you either offer placements or you have been offered a placement and you'd like to know a little bit more information about what to expect next. So if you want to go on to the next slide, Tahmina, you can tell everyone about the questions that we have.
Yep, sure. Need to activate the poll, don't I? Let me launch the poll first. Just a bit of an icebreaker. I've just launched a poll just to get a bit of an idea of where people are joining us from, a little bit about, which discipline you might have secured a placement in, that kind of thing.
So just to let you know, because we did this last time, didn't we, Tahmina? If you press OK before you finish, you don't get to answer all the questions. We didn't know that last time. So you'll see there are a few questions, and if you put in your answer and scroll down, and once you've answered the final question, which is number 5, then you press submit, and then we'll get all of your answers. If you answer question 1 and submit, then we only see that answer. So you can see the first question is, where are you based around the UK? And then a little bit about what you do. What's the main reason that you wanted to join us today, and what do you want to get from the session? And if you are going to do a placement, what discipline is it in? And then an excitement scale at the bottom. How excited are you about doing your placement, or are you worried at all? So we'll give you a few minutes to fill those in. Can you see the responses as they come in, Tahmina?
I can actually, yes. So we've had about 18 responses out of 55 so far. Slowly increasing.
Fab. So if you look on the bottom bar, when you're looking at the screen, if you put your mouse at the bottom, you'll see polls with a little histogram. If you click on polls, then you should be able to access the poll and you can pop your answers in. Some of them are selected, some of them are typing something in. What are the scores on the doors? How many have we got now?
About 32 have responded so far.
Excellent, excellent. So we'll give that another minute or two.
Highest so far where people are joining us from, East or West Midlands.
Oh, interesting.
And the next one is South East and West.
Okay.
And it's Northwest.
Right. Ooh, got clusters of people.
We've got none from Wales, Yorkshire or Scotland.
Oh, interesting.
So job role, the short answer, I can't actually see what the answer is.
For job role, I think we left that one as an open text. So for job role, that's for you to put in. If you're a trainee, associate practitioner, student, you're somebody who offers placements, you're the training officer, whatever it is that you do, you can pop that in. That's an open text one, so you can just type in whatever you want to put in there.
Okay, and the highest number of students in hematology, actually, yeah, hematology is the most popular.
Again, interesting.
And then we've got transfusion and microbiology coming second, and then histology and clinical biochem being the lowest with genetics.
That's an interesting profile, isn't it? Yeah, I would take the credit for that, Tahmina. It's all you. It's your hematology excitement and experience.
Yeah,
to do it.
It's not enough placements in hematology to say that.
Well, this data would say otherwise. That's really cool. So have we got most responses in, do you think?
Yeah, we've got 46 have responded. So I think,
Brilliant.
yeah, we can move on, I think, can't we now?
Lovely. Fabulous.
So I'm going to end the poll. Share the results as well, can't I?
Yeah, that's number 1. So we can see the answers there for where people are from. So yeah, you're right. East West Midlands is the highest, isn't it?
Okay. Right. I'm going to stop sharing the poll now, and then we can move on to our slides. Okay. So yeah, today's session will be, first of all, Sue will start off by talking about why the placement is important and go through a little bit of the, the portfolio and the HCPC standards. And I'll talk to you a little bit about sort of the contracts before you start placements, your pre-placement agreements, a little bit about the induction process and what to expect in that first week, in your first day of placement, a little bit about health and safety and the policies that you need to be familiar with, expectations of the placement provider and the student, any assessments that you might have during the placement year, where to go for support and advice during the placement year, a little bit about the portfolio, how many pieces of evidences you need, and how the portfolio is actually split up, a little bit about the verification process and the benefits of joining the IBMS as a member.
Lovely, thank you, Tahmina. So I thought it was useful at the start of the session just to remind people, I'm sure you are aware if you've already organised to go on a placement year or you are offering placements, that you know the reason that the placement is so important in the degree programmes. So there are two things that you need to be able to register with the HCPC as a biomedical scientist when you graduate. And the first thing is to have done an IBMS accredited degree programme, and that meets the standards of education and training. And the next thing you need is to meet the standards of proficiency, which are what are included in the IBMS registration training portfolio. So we as the Institute facilitate your completion of both the SEPs and the SOPs by looking at your degree, checking that it's got the right academic content, checking that it meets the standards of education and training on behalf of the HCPC. And then we have the IBMS registration training portfolio, which is what you'll work through when you're doing your placement year or your series of placements if you happen to be doing a healthcare science programme. So on the next slide, Tahmina, it literally has a couple more points about why that's important and how it can help. So what you would definitely need to get at the end of the process in order to be able to register is something called the Certificate of Competence. So again, the IBMS as the Institute, the professional body for biomedical scientists, are the ones that issue the Certificate of Competence. And to be able to get that certificate, you need to have completed an accredited degree programme and a clinical laboratory placement, or if you've done a non-accredited degree, the top-up supplementary education that you need to do along with a clinical laboratory training session where you would complete the portfolio. So I'm assuming most people on the call today at the webinar are doing an accredited degree, have organised a placement year for next year and are looking forward to having training during that year, which will help them to complete the registration training portfolio. Once the portfolio is complete and once your degree has been completed at the end of your final year, you will get in touch with the IBMS. Either your programme lead will do that if you're on an integrated degree, or if it's an optional sandwich placement, then you'll get in touch with us and say, I've done the accredited degree programme, I've done the portfolio, could you please issue my certificate of competence? Once we've issued the certificate of competence, we then let the HCPC know that you've got your certificate of competence, you're on the pass list, and then you can register with the HCPC. So eligibility to register is when we issue the IBMS certificate of competence to you, and then you can go onto the HCPC register as a biomedical scientist. So that's my bit finished, Tahmina. I'll turn off my camera and mic, and I'll just keep monitoring the questions and answers and chat. If anybody's got anything they'd like to ask, please do pop it in and we'll answer those as we go.
Thank you, Sue. Thanks. Okay, so a little bit about contracts. So if you've secured a placement recently, you will have had some paperwork to complete alongside the employer. So these contracts or pre-placement agreement usually includes information such as any expenses, financial arrangements, so whether they're offering any bursaries while you're on placement, things to do with holiday allowance, sick leave, any health and safety arrangements and risk assessments. You'll also be required to go through a DBS check. So the placement provider requires a copy of any criminal records and convictions. You'll also require some vaccinations, which is usually the Hep B, but all staff should really be up to date with their routine immunisations, which include tetanus, diphtheria, polio and MMR. And usually occupational health will get in touch with you about that to try and, get the documentation from you to evidence that. And usually your contracts will have a start date as well for your placement. That usually for most universities and placement students is beginning of September or in the first couple of weeks in September. So during your first week, you'll go through an induction process, and usually this involves meeting the staff members. So it's usually your training officer or the lab manager who will meet you first. And they'll introduce you to the team as well. So they'll walk you around the lab, introduce you to the staff members. Usually the induction will include an overview of the organisation. So a little bit about the lab itself and any policies that you'll need to be familiar with. They'll also explain to you what your role is and what their expectations of you are and any expectations that you might have of them. They'll cover that during that session. They'll talk to you a little bit about some of the processes that you'll need to comply with. So some of the things that I mentioned earlier, health and safety, quality, any statutory and mandatory training. And I will go through a little bit more of this in the next few slides, and any sort of expectations they have of your performance. So it's usually carried out by your training officer or the departmental manager and HR when it comes to things like sickness, absences, and that kind of thing. So you'll be introduced to your colleagues and the department. Hopefully you'll get a tour of the lab as well as the trust. So someone will show you around the trust itself, so you know, show you where the canteen is, where the library is, and any other facilities that you might be interested in. During the first day or the first week, you'll also be you'll be required to go and collect your ID badge so you can access entry into the lab. The IT department will set up an IT account for you and an email address so you can access through the lab's information system, and you'll be providing an overview of your role, so sort of a job description and what tasks you'll be expected to take part in. You'll also get some information on the statutory and mandatory training that you'll need to complete as part of your induction process. So some of the policies that you'll learn a little bit more about during the induction is health and safety, a little bit about quality management, the training and competency framework in the lab, absence policies, as well as annual leave entitlement. So during that induction week, there will be quite a lot of documents to read, and a lot of, if it's all electronic, then you'll be reading it online and kind of acknowledging and signing that you've read those documents. Now, the purpose of this is to make sure that you understand the health and safety requirements, the things around quality management and the training requirements, to make sure that you actually understand it and that you comply with it throughout the duration of your placement year. So there is a lot of documents to read during that first week, so do expect a lot of time to be sat in an office. Health and safety elements will include things like showing you around the emergency exits where they are, talking to you a little bit about the evacuation procedures, first aid facilities. So you'll notice when you're in the lab and they're taking you around, you've got first aid kits dotted around in the lab. You'll have a health and safety policy to read and sign to make sure that you know you've actually read it and understand what the requirements are. They'll go through the accident reporting policy with you as well. So if you've been involved in an accident yourself or you've witnessed an accident, how to go about reporting that. A little bit about working hours. So when you've secured a placement, you might be thinking, you know, what hours will I be working? It is usually core hours between 8:30 to 5, but this will vary depending on the lab that you're working in. They might have slightly different start times and end times. But again, you'll be given that information during your first week and in the induction. You do get provided with break times, usually one in the morning and one in the afternoon, sometimes 15 to 20 minutes. Again, it depends on what lab you're working in. And you do get a lunch break as well. So where I did my placement, we always had a 20-minute break in the morning at 10 o'clock or at 10:40, depending on if you're going early or late, and then one in the afternoon, which was usually around 3 o'clock or 3:40. Your lunch breaks are also split up. It can be either between 12 to 1 or 1 to 2. You do usually get asked which lunch break you prefer, but they do need to make sure that there's always someone in the lab to cover. So you might not always get the preference that you want. So sometimes you do have to work with your team members to compromise. So yeah, the reason why they need to be split up between the team is because we always need to make sure that there's a number of colleagues to cover the work that's coming into the lab and to make sure there's someone on the bench and processing the patient samples. Now, when you leave for breaks, please make sure you do come back on time. You're part of a team and other colleagues are waiting to go on break as well. So, you know, if you're going to be turning up late when you return from your breaks, other colleagues are waiting to go and you're holding them back, which then impacts the service that you provide. So do keep an eye on the time when you leave. A little bit of information about annual leave. So again, each trust and university will have their own local policies. Usually what trusts do is they do treat placement students the same as what the employee receives. So if an employee gets 25 days annual leave, for example, they also give the same amount of annual leave to the students. This usually needs to be booked in advance and agreed with the training officer or your work-based supervisor. The reason for that is because they need to know what to expect, you know, on a weekly basis. So a lot of the labs will have a rota And eventually, once you've been trained up, your name will start to appear on that rota, so you'll become part of the team. So if you are booking annual leave, they need to know that you're not going to be in on a certain day, so they don't put you on the rota in a certain department, and they can make sure there's enough cover in that team. Usually your placement is between 9 to 12 months, and that is because it's to make sure that you've been trained sufficiently and to make sure that you are competent, and to also allow you enough time to gather evidence for your portfolio and to be signed off by your training officer. So most placement students, it's up to you when you decide to take your annual leave. Most placement students do decide to take it all in one go over the summer. The reason for that is because they get a little bit of a break between when they finish the placement and before they return to the university for the final year of the studies. Now, if you have taken all your annual leave and you have had a number of absences, maybe due to sickness, you might need to make up for the shortfall. Again, this depends on the university policy and what agreement they've got with the lab. So it might mean that you need to make up for any shortfall. Again, a lot of the labs usually allow half a day study leave. Universities do also encourage that employers allow half a day study leave for placement students, and this gives them some time to work on the registration portfolio, to gather evidence and to write it up. Some labs might allow some additional time, but again, it just varies depending on what the workload is like and the staffing levels on a particular day. So it might be that, it's a little bit quiet during a time in the afternoon, maybe when things are slowing down a little bit, and you might be struggling to find things to do. Do speak to your team members first, ask them whether there's anything else that that you can help out with, and if there isn't anything and you feel like you could be using that time productively for your portfolio, you can always ask the question and say, it's a little bit quiet, and if there isn't anything for me to do or to help out with, then is it okay for me to work a little bit on my portfolio? Most labs are usually accommodating, but make sure you ask before you do. For study leave, some training officers might ask you to stay on site and use the library at the trust and do your work. A lot of labs have their own quiet office as well, where you can go and use the computer, print out things. So if you are required to stay on site, it is quite helpful sometimes because you can pull any documents out from the lab that you need, SOPs, for example, or any documents that are actually on site that you might need access to. Other trusts might allow you to leave the workplace and go to the library at the university, for example, or carry on doing your work on your portfolio at home. But it's really important that you do use that time that you get for study leave to actually write up your evidence. So what I normally do is I advise placement students to use the week where they're doing the training and they're actually on the job. If they come across something that they think will be really interesting as a piece of evidence, to keep it as a copy and then just put it into the folder. And then when it comes time to sit down for study leave, you've actually got that evidence in your folder ready to write up. And you're not wasting time walking around trying to find pieces of evidences because you've already got it gathered in your portfolio. A little bit about sickness and absences. So obviously, there are going to be times when you can't attend work because you're ill. And if you are too ill to work, then you need to phone the lab at the start of the day and speak to the training officer and let them know that you're not going to be in because you're sick. Again, each trust have their own local sickness policy, and the rules can vary depending on, if they want to treat you the same as an employee. A lot of the trusts do usually treat placement students and trainees the same as an employee. So this means that they do require you to call in every day that you're unable to attend work, unless you have a fit note, which means you don't need to ring in on a daily basis. Again, some trusts, if they're treating you as an employee, they might ask that if you've been off sick for over 7 days, then you will require a fit note. Now, when you are sick, please don't send text messages or an email or messages or put something on, communicate that through social media or messages from another person. Make sure you speak to the training officer or the senior in the lab that you're supposed to be working in. Don't hand the message over to someone else, text them and say, oh, can you let the senior know that I'm not going to be in today? It's not professional. So you do need to speak to someone directly. If your training officer isn't in, ask to speak to the senior of the lab, so at least they know that you're not in and they can make arrangements if they're short-staffed, pull someone in from another lab to come and help. Again, if the lab is treating you as an employee, they might ask to do a return to work meeting. Now, what that is usually is when a staff member has been off sick and they return to work, a meeting's usually held with that staff member. And it's usually just to make sure that you're well enough to work and that you are fit, and if there's anything the workplace can do to support you when you've returned after a period of sickness. Again, that will vary. Some trusts might not do that with placement students, and some will. So I'm trying to cover all bases. A little bit about the statutory and mandatory training that you'll be expected to complete. Now, this isn't the full list. I'm sure there will be plenty more, but it's just to give you a bit of an idea of what to expect. So you'll definitely have to complete health and safety, EDI, GDPR, things around confidentiality, fire safety, moving and handling, a little bit on infection prevention and control, safeguarding and preventing radicalisation. So you usually have to complete this during the induction week before you can actually go on to complete training in the lab. A lot of these e-learning courses that you complete can actually be used as evidence for the portfolio as well, depending on how you use it. So it might be that you take screenshots of questions that you've been asked after you've completed the training, or you printed out a certificate and you've annotated it and you've talked about how you've developed the knowledge and how you're going to apply it. And how it meets the HCPC standards of proficiency. So when you do complete some of these modules in the induction week, do keep an eye out on what kind of things you might want to be taking snapshots of or screenshots for your portfolio. Moving on to role-specific information. So as a trainee biomedical scientist, most of your core duties will be based on what a medical laboratory assistant, so MLA for short, will actually be doing. You will have some additional training on top of an MLA role because it's a trainee biomedical scientist job that you'll be doing. So there'll be some additional training and competency assessments that you'll need to complete. Usually you are provided with a training program at the start, and that usually outlines the details of any rotations that you'll be working throughout the placement year. Usually you do start off on specimen reception, but many labs might do it a little bit differently depending on what's going on during that time on specimen reception area. There might already be a lot of training going on in that area, so they might put you in the lab first and then move you on to specimen reception at a later date. But a training program will have details of these rotations so you know what to expect throughout the year and where you're going to be. You should also be provided with a training log at the start. So you take a folder with you and make sure you have everything in one place. So this training log that they provide you with will have a list of any tasks that you need to be completing throughout your training, and you'll be signed off as you complete your training. So your training officer will sign you off, or the senior in the lab, the person who's training you, with a date and a signature, and you will also be expected to sign that as well to record that you have been trained in a particular area. Now, your competency assessment is a separate document. Once you've been trained in an area, you then go through a competency assessment where you're actually observed performing a particular task. So to give you an example, if you start off on specimen reception, say, for example, you've spent 6 to 8 weeks in specimen reception, you've been trained and you've been shadowing staff members, and you've been signed off on your training log. Someone will then observe you, usually a senior member of staff. They'll observe you debagging a sample, booking it in and preparing it. And while they're observing you, they'll be ticking off on a list that you've ticked, that you've followed the process correctly without any prompts. And if you're able to complete those tasks without any prompts or anything like that, then they can sign you off and you are competent to complete that task unsupervised. So to give you an example of a training log, this is a snapshot of a page that I've taken from something where I used to work in specimen reception. So here you can see on the left-hand side where it says sample acceptance criteria, so whether you've actually read the document. So if you have, the staff member, the senior staff member will check that you have and they'll sign it to say that you've read it, and you will also sign it as well. And then dealing with unlabeled or mislabeled samples, how to deal with missing samples or leaking samples, for example. Those are the kind of things that you'll be expected to work on and be competent in by the time you finish your placement. So you can use evidences like this for your portfolio. Once you've completed a training log or a competency assessment and you've got signatures on there, you can actually annotate it and show which areas you've been trained in and talk about how it meets the standards of proficiency and put it in the portfolio as evidence. So throughout the placement year, you'll develop knowledge and skills in a number of areas, especially team working. You'll be part of a team where you'll be expected to work with staff from all different grades, starting from MLAs to associate practitioners, qualified biomedical scientists, specialist biomedical scientists, seniors, clinical scientists, consultants, nurses, lots of different job roles. So you'll be working with them and developing your skills in that area, as well as communication. So there is a full module in the portfolio on communication. So again, you'll be expected to attend lab meetings. You'll also have your regular meetings with your training officer, so you'll be developing your communication skills in that way. A lot of labs usually have a handover document as well. So at the end of a day shift, there's a document where they complete a document to show that any tasks that might be outstanding for the next person that comes on a late shift, those documents can be used as evidence for portfolio as well, because it's showing communication. Say, for example, you've been expected to answer the telephone in the lab. Again, verbal communication. So usually labs have a telephone log that sits next to the telephone. So if you've answered a call, you're expected to fill in that telephone log. You record the date and time that you answered the call, the name of the person that you spoke to, the department that they're calling from, and what the query is. So the purpose of that is so the lab have an audit of all the calls that have come through. So say, for example, there's a sample that a nurse has sent and it's not been processed. They might ring up the lab and speak to you and ask where this patient sample is. You then check the system to look whether we've actually received that sample and whether you've got results for it. It might be that you've not even received the sample, so you would record that on the telephone log and say, actually, we've not received it. Can you go back and check whether you've sent it? Or you would go on specimen reception and speak to your colleagues and ask whether there's a sample that they haven't yet come across, which is why there's a delay. Again, if you've answered a call like that, you're able to use that as a piece of evidence towards the portfolio. Other areas as well that you'll develop skills in are interpersonal skills and time management skills. So your time management is extremely important. For some of you, this might be your first experience of a full-time working job. So you'll be getting used to managing working full-time as well as working on your portfolio at the same time, and any assessments that you might have during the placement year. So again, really important. I mentioned that you'll be working with lots of team members within the lab, but actually you'll also be working with colleagues from various departments throughout the trust. So there's lots of different departments. There's a few that I've listed there. So outpatients, clinics, theatres and wards, but a lot of different professionals that work in these areas. So you'll have nurses, doctors, clinicians, consultants, transfusion practitioners. There's a lot more. I've just listed a few there, but you'll be interacting with all these different professionals and answering queries, working together to make sure that you provide the best possible care for patients. You will have regular meetings with your training officer. So at the start, it usually can be maybe twice a month just to get you started off, or it can be once a month. So it's usually once a month as a minimum. And during these meetings, your training officer provides any feedback on any evidence that you put in your portfolio. They'll check that you're progressing as expected throughout your training and check any areas that you are competent in now, so they can move you on into a different lab or rotate you around. And they'll also set any deadlines or targets to achieve before the next meeting. So these are regular meetings to make sure that you're on track, you're able to complete the portfolio on time, and that you are producing good quality evidence. You will also be expected to have meetings with your university placement tutor, who will arrange meetings with you and your training officer while you're on placement. Now, these are opportunities to check in with you, make sure you're settling in well, make sure you're progressing with your training. They'll also be able to provide you any updates from the university if there's any major changes happening. And they'll be checking the progress of your training and the portfolio. So usually placement tutors do ask for copies of training logs and competency assessments, and these are for audit purposes. So when it comes to IBMS reaccreditation for the degrees, the IBMS ask that we have a separate audit process, and that we're also making checks to ensure that the labs have completed training and competencies as well. So we do look at training logs and make sure you are progressing and that you are signed off before you're working unsupervised in any particular area. But the purpose of those meetings is also to provide support for both parties. So yes, we're there to support placement students, but also the placement provider should they need it. So moving on to expectations of a placement student. Placement students are usually treated as an employee and they are part of the team. So you are expected to behave in a professional manner. Please do make sure you are punctual. If you're going to be late, make sure you phone the lab and let them know. It is nice that you're part of the team and that you do become friends with your colleagues, but try and avoid distractions such as too much chatting. When you're in the lab, you are required to be focused and concentrate. A lot of errors and mistakes can happen and we can miss things by not concentrating. So just be aware. Don't use your mobile phone in the lab. You should know that at university as well. You're not allowed to use your mobile phone in the lab. It's an infection control hazard. If you are expecting an urgent call, so say for example, it might be that you're expecting a call from the doctors or you might have other commitments, let the senior in your department know on the day that you might have to keep your phone on you, and that when you do receive a call, you'll step out of the lab to take that call. Another question that a lot of placement students have is what to wear. So smart and casual is fine. Don't wear open-toe shoes such as flip-flops. And do remember that the placement year is sort of like a 12-month interview process. You are being observed by your colleagues and how you work within the team and your work ethic. A lot of trusts do usually offer placement students a job at the end of it, depending on, how impressed they are with the way that you've presented yourself and whether there's a position at the end of it. They're investing a lot of time in your training, so it's really important that you respect that. Now, moving on to expectations of the placement provider. They're expected to provide learning opportunities. Provide learning opportunities which enable the student to take on a defined role within the lab. They're expected to provide suitable supervision and support to allow students to achieve the intended learning outcomes, which is specifically towards completing the IBMS registration portfolio. They'll be defining a set of tasks that allows the student to develop relevant skills, whether that's subject specific or generic. That's to help you achieve the competencies and standards that's outlined in the registration portfolio and to meet the HCPC standards of proficiency. They're also expected to provide training to support the development of your skills to practice as a biomedical scientist. They will also encourage you to analyse and reflect on your contribution within the lab, and they need to make sure that you're fully trained and competent before you are performing any tasks unsupervised. They also need to fulfil their responsibilities regarding legislation such as health and safety in the workplace, and also looking at the level of skill and experience of placement students in the lab. So usually when placement tutors meet up with you during your placement year, they'll take some time to speak to your training officer first to see how things are going and whether they need any support, and they'll talk a little bit more about any academic expectations of you. If your placement provider or training officer needs any support, they will contact your placement tutor directly. So for placement students, we know that placements can be challenging, especially if it is your first experience of working full time. But in the first instance, it's your training officer that you can reach out to for support. But you can also reach out to your university placement tutor as well. If you have any disabilities or require any reasonable adjustments to help you perform your role properly, make sure you communicate well with the placement provider so you are fully supported and that you can actually complete the tasks that's expected of you. If you do have any concerns or issues, please speak to your training officer first. You can also reach out to the university placement tutor if you feel like you need to. A meeting might be required if there is a serious concern, so that will usually take place with the placement student and the training officer and the placement tutor to address these concerns. If these concerns are related to performance and professionalism, an action plan is usually completed with clear targets. So say, for example, if it's around professionalism or punctuality and attendance, the placement tutor will step in and complete an action plan. There'll be a document that you need to complete, and your progress will be monitored throughout the next few weeks. If there is unsatisfactory progress, it might be that the student needs to withdraw from the placement, so the training officer might actually want to terminate the placement because they're thinking that there isn't any progression or improvement in the behaviour of the student. So some universities do have assessments as part of the placement year. Usually your placement tutor will provide information before you go on placement. And so any information that's related to this. Make sure you do check your university emails regularly as well. So when you go on placement, you are provided with an email account with your workplace, but you will still have access to your university email. So do make sure you check in those regularly in case your placement tutor decides to email you on your university email rather than your workplace one. A little bit about the portfolio. Hopefully many of you will have already been familiar with this or had a look at it if you've secured a placement already. So the portfolio itself is split up into 2 sections and that's 5 modules each. So there's 10 modules in total. For each module, you're required to provide 3 evidences each. So in total, it's 30 pieces of evidence for the whole portfolio. And your training officer will support you in gathering the evidences for that and provide feedback on any evidences that you've already provided, or they'll give you examples of what else you can be including in the portfolio. I do usually advise placement students to keep a reflective log or a diary during the placement. Even if you're not writing huge chunks on a daily basis, if you just put the date down and a sentence of what you've done on that day, sometimes it's really good for jigging your memory when it comes down to when you sit for your study leave and you're trying to write up something on a piece of evidence. You can look through your diary and it might give you a bit of a pointer on what evidence you need to be looking for. It's also really good practice for CPD. Students need to show evidence that they've achieved the competencies and standards that are outlined in the portfolio. So if you're every day writing something in your diary and you've got a bit of a log, that can really help with that as well. So when you sit down and have a look at the portfolio and there's something in there that you noticed that you might have done last week or a couple of weeks ago, flick through your diary and it can help you, and you can go back to that department and look for anything that you need that will be useful as evidence for the portfolio. Once you've completed the portfolio and it's all been signed off, so again, this will vary. Some training officers might want the verification to take place before the student goes back to complete the final year of university. Some training officers might advise the student to put the verification on hold until they've completed the degree, and then they can come back and do the verification then and a lab tour. So usually when the portfolio is completed, the training officer contacts the IBMS or the university for the portfolio verification to take place. Once a verifier has been allocated, they will agree a date and time with your training officer for the verification to take place. The portfolio will be reviewed by the verifier, so they'll look at your pieces of evidences, make sure that they do meet the standards of proficiency and that your evidence is of good quality. You'll be required to give a tour of the lab. The verifier will ask you questions during the tour, which you should be able to answer, and these can vary from health and safety to specimen reception, confidentiality, and any legislations and policies and quality management processes. If your verification is successful, the verifier will complete a report and then they'll send it to the IBMS and let them know. Once you've successfully completed the degree and the IBMS can send you that certificate of competence, you can then apply for HCPC registration and practice as a biomedical scientist. It is really useful as well for placement students to join the IBMS as a student member. They do give you a lot of advice on the website, and you can attend lots of these online sessions as well, similar to today. There are different membership grades that guide you through every stage of the career. So you've got your e-student, and then once you've become qualified, you can upgrade to a licentiate. Once you complete your specialist portfolio, you can move up to member. And it is only £12 a year. You get access to all the resources and newsletters and online webinars. So really useful for CPD as well. And you can also get lots of things that might help you for your portfolios, evidence as well. And thank you. So any questions, please, in the chat. I've not been able to see anything throughout that. So we can answer those questions now, Sue. And then there is also a QR code for you to give us some feedback on the session as well.
Lovely, thank you, Tahmina. I've been answering questions as we're going through, but we can go back through those in the chat just to make sure that we both agree. And there were a couple that I said I'd answer at the end. Assumpta has had a hand up for a little while. I don't know if you can unmute. I can as a panelist, but you might be able to unmute if you go to the attendees,
Yeah.
if someone wanted to ask something.
I can see, oh yeah, allowed to talk. So I've asked them to unmute themselves.
Can you unmute Assunta?
No, I can't unmute them myself, but I've asked them to unmute. So I don't know if it's just a mistake.
Yeah, doesn't say I can't unmute. So yeah, if you did have a question or something, if you just want to pop it into the chat or into the Q&A, we can pick that up. So if we go back through some of the questions that I've answered, we had a few around inoculations, Tahmina. So we had one person asking specifically about Hep B and somebody else asking about MMR and diphtheria. So the questions were, do I need to have them before I go? And I said, yes, the short answer is you should have them because it takes a little bit of time for your immunity to come up. So Hep B, I think, is still 3 inoculations, isn't it? So most placement providers like you to have at least 2 before you get on placement, and then you can have your 3rd one later. But for the others, if you ask at your local GP or if you ask at your university, sometimes the university coordinates inoculations for placement students. So ask at both places depending on the setup that you have with your university, and then hopefully you can find out the answer to that. So that was around inoculations. Other people have got some general inquiries about how to register with the HCPC, which I've been answering as I go along, but I can answer any of the ones that have come in towards the end. Sonia had a question. Sonia is a training officer, I think, or a training manager, and asked about an update on the new version of the portfolio. So I'm quite happy to answer that, Sonia. So version 5 of the portfolio is almost finished. We've released a mapping document, so you know where all the different standards of proficiency will be in the modules and sections. The sections and modules are the same, with the exception of module 2 in both sections. So module 2 in section 1 will become equality, diversity and inclusion. And section 2, module 2, will become health and safety and well-being. So they're parts of the standards of proficiency that have been expanded by the HCPC. So we've incorporated them into the modules where they make the most sense. There is a mapping document that we can point people to when we do a follow-up after the session today that has where all of the new standards are in each of the modules, so you know where they are. The other thing that we're doing is each of the sections and each module will have a mandatory piece of evidence as number 1. So I need to write a short briefing document, which is what that is, the reason that we've chosen it, and which standards that will be hitting. And then, you know, for your training plans, for evidences 2 and 3, they are up to you and the candidate to choose. That still gives flexibility, but a bit of a framework to build a portfolio on. And we've been consulting on that, which is why it's taken a little bit of time to get the information out. But we'll tell you what the evidence is that we're going to say is mandatory, and then you choose the other 2 pieces of evidence, and you will know which bits of the HCPC standards you're trying to hit with the evidence 2 and 3 for each module. So hopefully that's helpful. The new version of the portfolio will be a digital one. So Jim and I are working hard on that to get that ready. It is only 6.5 weeks until the 1st of September, but people will be issued with a portfolio. They won't be completing it straight away, obviously. So it gives us a bit of time for people to get used to the new portfolio and uploading their evidence digitally and that kind of thing. So lovely. Thank you, Sonia. I can see you said helpful in the comments. So could you just put in the chat for me, Sonia? Have you seen that mapping document? If you haven't, then I'll make sure that everybody gets the link for that again, because it was released as a news item on the web page. So if people haven't seen it, then we can make sure. So let me just see, Harini's asked a question about CPD portfolios. The only thing that will allow you to register is the IBMS registration training portfolio. So a few people have asked about, I haven't done an IBMS accredited degree, what do I need to do? And that will be having your degree assessed by the Institute, and I've put the link for that in the answer to everybody that's asked that question. The portfolio you need to do has to be the IBMS registration training portfolio to enable you to get the certificate of competence. So if you're already in employment, you can talk to your employer about, could you have a training portfolio? Could you have a training plan? Do they have capacity to train you so that you can become a biomedical scientist? But if you've done a non-accredited degree alongside that, you'll need us to look at it, tell you if you've got any supplementary education to do, and then undertake that further study while you're doing the training portfolio at the same time. So depending on what degree you have, it will take you longer to get your registration organised. If you're doing an IBMS accredited programme, there was a question from someone who has a 3-year version of the programme at their university, but no integrated placement and no sandwich placement. So their question to me was about how they go about it. They're going into year 2 next year. So I suggested that they talk to the university tutors and careers advisors about how to get a CV and a cover letter organised, and then have a think about where it is that they would like to do a placement. So would you advise the same?
Yeah, and if you feel like you're not sure about which specialism, you can have a read around the different specialisms. I actually did some recordings on specialisms in biomedical science a few months ago. So those recordings, I'm just working with the IBMS comms teams to make available. So if you are interested, we have covered a number of specialisms that you might want to apply for. I would say as a placement student though, don't restrict yourself to one area, because you can do your training in one discipline but actually apply to work as a biomedical scientist in any discipline. It does help obviously if you've done your training. So for example, I did my training in haematology, but when I first started working as a biomedical scientist, I worked in biochemistry and then moved into haematology afterwards again. So you don't always have to work in the specialism that you did your training in initially.
Yeah, and sometimes you need to be a little bit flexible in that you really want to do a placement. The placement is the important thing, and if it's not your perfect discipline or it's not in your perfect location, then sometimes you need to be a little bit flexible, don't you, to be able to secure the placement. So yeah, we'd ask you to be a little bit open-minded. And Penny's asked in the chat, will there be some guidance on how to complete the electronic portfolio? Yes, Penny, there'll be lots of advice and guidance. So Jim and I are working on guidance documents that we can release. We're going to launch the portfolio formally at Congress for anyone who can go to Congress. We'll try and make sure that there are videos of that when we're talking about it so people can access that. And we'll also have some online and some face-to-face training. So we're very keen to get out there. Jim and Sue Roadshow may be coming to visit you soon to let people know. So we know it's a big change. We know that people might be a little bit apprehensive about what is it and how does it work, but we'll definitely make sure people know what they're doing. So please don't worry about that. I'm trying to think, were there any other questions? Everyone's just come in. They haven't seen the map. That's fine, Sonia. I'll make sure the mapping document comes around with for anybody who's attended today. Yeah. I think it'll be useful to send that again just so people can see it. And it's a one-page document. It's really straightforward. It's just dots in the module so you can see where things are. A few questions from international people about how to register with the HCPC that I went through as you were talking. And I think that was it really. Lots of people asking about registration and membership. They're slightly different things. So we're the professional body and you can choose to be a member of ours, or you need to be a member to do some qualifications, but you have to be registered with the HCPC to practice and to use that protected title of a biomedical scientist, just in case anybody was a bit confused about the two. I think they're all the questions, Tahmina. So unless anybody's got a burning question they'd like to put into the Q&A now, or...
Someone's asked about whether they need to purchase the portfolio themselves, and if so, how much is it? Usually if you're doing a placement year with the university, they provide that for you. If you've had to source a placement yourself, if the lab doesn't pay for it, then the student might have to order it themselves. How much is it, Sue? Is it 130?
It's 137 at the moment. It is going to go up next year because we obviously need to fund the digital version of it, but it's 137 at the minute. It should be that your university or the training lab pay for that. It's quite unusual that a student needs to foot that bill themselves, because that's not really fair to ask the student to pay for it. So I would ask questions around who would normally pay for it, and it would normally come from a training budget or it would come from your university, but I would ask those questions. If you're looking to find your own placement, again, would be something that I would ask when you're looking at secure placement, who pays for the portfolio, because you know £137 is still £137, isn't it? And somebody's asked if the PowerPoint could be sent to you to look at later. Yes, so for anyone who's not come to a webinar before, what we do is this video will be uploaded onto the webpage. You will have open access to it. You can point any friends, colleagues to it that haven't been able to join us, and they can have a look at the video itself and the slides. So all of that will come to you afterwards. And if you fill in the questions at the end, if there's any extra support or help that you would like, if you can scan this QR code on the last slide, you can pop those requests into that and we'll follow up on that. I can just see someone else has asked about Hep B vaccinations. So what you'll need to do for your Hep B is, even if you've had it before, they do time out. So you would need to look at your vaccination record and ask your GP for your vaccination record and see when were you last inoculated and how long does it last for. If you ring your GP surgery, they're usually quite helpful on the phone. If you explain the situation and say you don't know whether you need the boosters or not, they can normally look at your record for you and advise you. Would you agree, Tahmina? Is that been your experience?
Yeah, that's right. I've got a question here about how to prepare for a placement to get a little ahead of the game. So you can look at, well, the new portfolio is not out yet, so I'm not going to say look at the reference. You can look at the reference copy, the current version, just so you know what to expect for the, so you can look out for pieces of evidences when you do start. But actually, you can have a look at the modules that you've already studied at university and see if there's anything in there that you can pull out as piece of evidence. So one of the good ones that I usually recommend is the health and safety, because you will have covered health and safety in the lab in your first year. It's one of the first things that you do in the first week when you enter the lab. You'll be given information on PPE, risk assessments, all of that kind of thing. So you can actually have a look at what you've done within that area and take copies, put it into your portfolio. So then when it comes to starting the work, you can write it up and your training officer can agree whether they think that's sufficient or not, or they might ask you to add to it a little bit. There might be some case studies that you've done in a module in your second year, for example, that actually has results from a lab that you've completed. You can actually annotate them and actually in the lab, say for example, if it's a hematology practical that you've done, so we do something on sickle cell. We've done that at university, but if you complete a placement in hematology, you might want to put your case study in from university, but then build on that using results that you've actually got from the placement and show how you've developed that case study and built it to demonstrate how your knowledge and experience, you know, how you've built on it as a trainee.
Yeah.
So those are kind of things you can be doing to prepare.
Definitely. So you can have a think about things you've done at university where it was too inside. It's always putting it in the context of working in the lab, isn't it, Tahmina, rather than just putting in some evidence. And that's something I did a couple of years ago. It's about putting it into context and how is it useful to you in the workplace and what you're doing at the moment. There's a few questions about what to take in on a daily basis and when to start applying for placement. So we can definitely look at those. Will be a separate webinar about the portfolio. If you look at the March, the IBMS Support Hub, March this year, we did one about the HCPC standards and what was changing. So you can have a look at that. The evidence that you're going to gather and how to do that is what your training officer will go through when you do the placement. So they can talk to you about the sorts of training plans they have, the kind of evidence that they would normally suggest might be good to hit the standards of proficiency that you're trying to hit. Nadia's asked about future webinars. So if you have a look on the IBMS webpage, I'll pop it in the Q&A in a second. All of the IBMS support hubs are listed for the rest of the year, so we can make sure that you can see where they are, and we advertise on social media. So if you're on LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter, then you should be able to see those, Nadia. So I'll pop in the web page that you need to see these, but I will do that now, pop that in the Q&A for you.
Also, I think if student members, they do get regular emails as well.
Yeah,
because a lot of our hub sessions have been targeted for students and graduates. The other question I did see somewhere about any online courses or resources that you can look at to prepare for placement. Again, similar to the question that I answered previously on the modules that you can be looking at university. But the IBMS Support Hub sessions, actually, the one that we did in May was related to EDI. Again, that's a module in the portfolio. So there is a recording available on the IBMS website. So if you are interested, you can have a look at that. And you could use your learning and use that as a piece of evidence for the portfolio as well. Yeah.
So I'm just going to find the page. I've just got it for the support hubs. I'll put that into the Q&A, so hopefully everybody can see that. I'll type that for Nadia, but again, we could send that around. So I'll make sure that we do the PDF of the mapping document and also send around the link for the next support hubs as well.
Someone's asked what happens if the university is unable to provide a placement, and how do I find my own placement to register for the programme? You can reach out to your local NHS trusts, find out first if they're an IBMS approved training lab, and you can ask them if there's an opportunity to come in and do a placement for a year. If you do secure that yourself without going through the university, you just need to make sure you let the university know so they can put a pause on the programme. So when you go away on placement and then you come back, you just complete your final year.
Harina's asked questions around finding the placement and the portfolio again. If you are already employed in the NHS, you can't do a placement because a placement is part of a degree programme. So a placement is something that you do when you're studying. It's not something that you do when you are working. So if you are already in employment, then you need to speak to somebody in your place of work and tell them that you're interested in completing the registration training portfolio and ask them about opportunities to be able to do that. In the place where you work at the moment. So if you're in employment and you're working in a support role, it's not a placement you need to look for, it's about training. We don't have that on our IBMS web pages. We don't tell you where those opportunities are. It's in your own trust, or it's by making contact with people in other trusts, and then you find those. You can look on the NHS Jobs webpage. The NHS Jobs webpage will advertise support worker roles and also training positions if they come up. So you can certainly look there, but it's not something that we look after as the Institute. That's something that workplaces look after themselves, about which jobs are on offer and who is able to access training plans.
A few questions around paid placements or bursaries. Again, this will depend on the lab. So if you've gone through an interview process, you can ask that question, whether there will be any bursaries. If you have already secured a placement and you've not asked, it's usually in the pre-placement agreement that I talked about at the beginning in the contract. A lot of trusts, they do provide bursaries for travel costs and things. Some placements are paid, but many trusts are also offering unpaid placements. So you do have to take a year out and about how you're going to support yourself financially. So you might have a part-time role, or if you're living at home and not expected to contribute towards rent and things, it might be a little bit easier.
But if you are a student, you do get your student loan for that year. So there is no bursary allocated to the placement. There is no government funding for the placements. But if you are a student, you can tell Student Finance England that you're doing an unpaid placement and you can access your student loan for that year. And the amount of money that you receive should be similar to what you've already had previously for the first and second year. Student Finance England allocate 4 years worth of funding to students. So you will be able to access the extra year's worth of funding. So please don't have no money. That funding is there for you if you do want to do the placement, but the laboratories sometimes can offer travel costs, as Tahmina said. They can't offer you a wage, or they can't offer you a bursary that's enough for you to live on, unfortunately. And there is no pot of money centrally for you to be able to apply to. So it would be a case of additional funding from Student Finance England, but that will enable you to pay your rent, travel costs, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you don't usually pay tuition fees for that year, though, that you're on placement year.
That's right. It's normally a much smaller amount, isn't it? So it's like a retainer fee if you're doing a placement year, that you would normally have just a small amount to pay to the university. So you still get access to the VNE and to your placement tutor and that kind of thing, but it's not your normal fee. So that's very different, but you should get the living, the finances for you to be able to live on.
Should we just ask so one final question, Sue, and then
we're up to time, aren't we? Yeah, and then we can answer any others we've not got to. We can send around some answers afterwards, can't we?
Yeah, so the recording will be made available afterwards. So usually anyone who's attended, registered and attended, you'll get a link through email. Otherwise, it's on the IBMS website. If you go under resources, there's a heading that says IBMS Support Hub sessions. So you just click on the recording that you want to access. So one final question, can you finish the placement earlier than 9 months if you complete the portfolio?
It's unusual to complete it in less than 9 months. Sometimes what students do is work through the portfolio. They're pretty much finished by Easter time, and their verification is organised over the summer, and then they work in the lab again in a support role, because they won't be on the register at that point. But they can work in the lab over the summer if that's useful to them into the lab. So most people take around 9 months to finish it. Some universities ask you to do some work towards your final year module. So when I used to run a degree programme, we asked the students to look at papers and things for their research project. So that's when Tahmina was saying, keep in touch with the university if you've got any assessments coming or any work that they'd like you to do. So most people who start in September tend to be finishing around April, May time, finishing up last bits of evidence, making sure they're ready for the verification. And it can take a few weeks to organise verification. So if you know you do need to be verified before you go back to university, you need to be asking for the verification in the spring. Once you've finished, to make sure you've got plenty of time to get that organised.
Right, thank you. Hopefully everyone's answered the feedback form as well on the QR code. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Lois has just said she's grateful for the session and she can't wait to start a placement. That's very good.
Great.
And somebody said the same. You feel more confident. That's good. That's what today's session was all about, just reassuring you about what to expect. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for joining us today. We'll get through the questions if we haven't had a chance to answer them, and we'll try and make sure that comes around when we let you know the resources are there. So lovely to see you all. Thank you very much for joining us.